From the town of Tyngsborough, I'm Ronnie Camille, and this is Entering Tyngsborough. Coming up on the podcast, a conversation with the Tyngsborough town manager on the next proposed fiscal year 26 operating budget.
I want people at town meeting to feel like they own the budget, they had say in how it was developed, and that's what we're trying to do.
Mr. Town Manager, Colin, welcome to Tyngsborough's Front Porch.
Greetings. It's great to be here.
So I always start the program asking to introduce yourself and describe the role in the town of Tyngsborough. Obviously, people know who you are, but let's just, for somebody that may just stumbled on the program for the first time, who are you?
Absolutely. So my name is Colin Loiselle. I serve right now as the town manager in Tyngsborough. I've been in this role since September of 23, so a year and a half at this point. Prior to that, I served as Tyngsborough's assistant town manager, director of administrative services, executive assistant to the select board, and I also spent some time as an intern and a part-time finance clerk. So I've been around in Tyngsborough for quite some time. I'm loving the role. The role of town manager is basically making sure that government operates the way that residents expect. Tyngsborough has a town manager form of government, which means that the select board set the long-range policies, and town meeting is the legislative body. They set the budget, bylaws, and it's my job and our staff, obviously, to implement that, manage it, and make sure that trash gets picked up, roads are paved, operations move the way that they're supposed to.
Spoken like a true municipal manager. You already took all the questions that I was going to put into and use for social media.
Well-programmed, Ronnie.
Well-programmed. So you're here with us today to talk about basically the municipal function, the money aspect of it. And right now, as we're taping this in the middle of March, we are in the smack middle of what we call budget season. The day before we recorded this, you sat with the select board, who is the kind of the highest kind of body besides town meeting, and you kind of gave an overview of what to expect in next fiscal year. So for those who are unfamiliar with the process, can you give us a high-level overview of how the town budget is developed from start to finish?
Absolutely. The budget is, in its simplest form, the backbone of all of our government operations. As all of us know painfully well, nothing happens without money supporting it. And so our budget sets the tone for everything that we're going to do in a fiscal year. In Massachusetts, the fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th, because why make anything simple? But during that period, we stick to the parameters set within the budget, which is ultimately approved by town meeting. So I just like to start every conversation about the budget by reminding people that myself and our staff at Town Hall do the hard work of compiling the budget and making a recommendation, but this is ultimately town meeting's budget, because town meeting has the ability to veto specific line items, to make amendments on the town meeting floor, though we hope they don't have to, but ultimately they're also the ones that approve it. So how does the budget process start? We can only spend the money that we generate, right? And so the first thing we do, and this is on an ongoing basis, starting in the second or third month of the fiscal year, is looking at our revenues and how we're trending for the current fiscal year.
And what are the revenues?
Most of our revenue comes from property tax, which is what our residents are probably most familiar with. That's the taxes you pay on your house. In Tyngsborough, the tax rate is $12.14 per 1,000 of value. Mm-hmm. That changes every year, and property tax is constrained by Prop 2.5, which is a law that says a municipality can only increase the taxes by 2.5% plus any new growth every year. So it's a protection that was put in place, I want to say the late 80s or early 90s, to ensure that municipal budgets weren't dramatically ballooning, which of course has an impact on residents. So that's our biggest source of revenue. We generate some revenue in the form of state aid. That's money that comes from the state for various purposes. And, I like to be very transparent that all of these revenue forms are people's taxes, right? So the money that goes to the state that then comes back to the town is money that people who live in Tyngsborough have paid to the state. It's just coming back in a different form. And that covers Chapter 70 funding, which funds our educational initiatives, Chapter 90, which funds road paving, and we can talk about that in a little bit. And then we have all kinds of other miscellaneous areas of revenue. Talk about fees that people pay when they apply for building permits, right? We talk about new growth, which is when something new is constructed in town that gets added to our tax levy and we can tax on it. We also make revenue on areas that you don't generally think about. So in Massachusetts, there's an excise tax on your automobiles. that revenue comes back to the town. Same thing when you buy a meal at any of the restaurants in Tyngsborough. There's a meals excise tax. Hotels as well. And then there are other kind of, I consider them administrative revenues. So we make money on our investments. All of our money is in interest yielding bank accounts, and that generates interest, and we're able to reinvest that money back into the general fund. So it's a mix of things, but again, really our biggest revenue source is personal property and real estate property, which is paid directly by residents.
And so from all those revenue sources that are coming in, how does the town determine where to allocate all these resources, and what departments or services require most of these funding?
Yeah, it's a tough question. One of the things that I say is a fortunate kind of negative reality of Tyngsborough's budget situation is that our budget is so conservatively planned that there doesn't really exist a lot of wiggle room for rethinking how we spend our money on a greater scale. So basically, the way our money is allocated is based on the level of service that we deliver today, and we've been able to, over time, make adjustments to fit our growth projections and how the community is developing. 67% of the money that the town spends goes to education, which is very common in the Commonwealth. That is our Tyngsborough public school system, which we're fortunate is very well run. It has great outcomes, and so a lot of our students stay in that school district. But then we also pay an assessment every year to Greater Lowell Tech, which is a different form of education. It's a technical vocational school that we're proud to host in Tyngsborough. We get assessed annually based on our enrollment. Those are our biggest categories of spending. There are some other educational expenses. Anytime we send a student to the charter school, that comes directly off of our Chapter 78, so it's not necessarily us paying the money.
And also children that are not enrolled in the school from, I believe, age 2 to 5, correct? If they need special services or...
yeah, a lot of our, yes, out-of-district placement spans the spectrum. Anytime a student in our district that is eligible for public education requires a curriculum or specialized services or resources that we're simply not able to provide, we are required to pay for that student to go to a district where they can accommodate it. Those are incredibly hard to budget for, and so we've done some creative things. We've created a special ed stabilization fund, which helps mitigate that, really with the focus on making sure that students get the resources they need wherever those resources are available. And again, that's very common and unique, not unique in Massachusetts.
That's just overall in the United States.
Overall in the United States. So biggest education is the biggest spender, of course. Coming in below that, obviously public safety, public works, those are some of the larger departments that encompass the infrastructure that residents rely on, sewer, roads to get from work to home or to school. And then public safety is, of course, our police and fire departments, which need to grow over time to match the growth of the community. You can't police a community with the same staffing levels you had, say, in the 70s when the population is now tremendously higher.
Sure, absolutely. I know you've been a big proponent of education, just educating the public about the process. There's one thing that you said, you can't expect the public to vote on and the operating budget for Tyngsborough is how much again?
This year we're proposing a $52.2 million budget.
You're expecting, you said in the past, how can you expect the public to vote on a $50 million budget when they have a lot going on? And so, there's two questions. Can you explain how the budget is presented to the public? And opportunities that residents have to provide input.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Ronnie. That's what the sentiment that you shared, that I have certainly shared with our staff, and I think we've kind of imposed that on the way that we're running town right now, is that we have to do the hard work on the government side to make sure that residents know what's happening. And that's why things like Entering Tyngsborough, the podcast that the media department does, the various social media outreaches that we do, our new digital sign in the town center, right? We really have adopted the mindset in Tyngsborough, and I'm incredibly proud of it, that we have to force as much information as we can on residents, because you're right, somebody who's raising a family, starting their career, maybe winding down their career and looking to spend a little bit more time traveling,
may not be watching the news anymore.
We can't expect them to, on on their own go out and do the work to find this. So we've applied that mindset first and foremost with the budget. $52.2 million is what we're asking town meeting to approve. And I always joke, you watch any of our town meetings, we can spend an hour and a half, 2 hours debating a zoning article. And then when the budget comes up, it's a motion to approve and it's a vote and it passes. And I think that on one hand, that's representative of the fact that folks trust the government that we've created here in Tyngsborough, and I'm proud of that. But I also just think it's that many people don't know where to begin when it comes to the budget. So with that mindset in mind, last year was the first budget that I put together as town manager, and we really focused on saying, okay, if I'm a resident that has no familiarity with municipal government, what do I need to know? And how can I get that information? Here's what we know. Going to town meeting and asking a question in front of 200 of your neighbors can be incredibly intimidating.
Yes.
I'm a paid professional. I get paid to sit up on that stage, and even sometimes I'm intimidated. So we said, how do we break this down? And we've always done pre-town meeting in Tyngsborough, but even that can generate a crowd. So last year we launched budget office hours, which are very small, informal meetings where residents can come either collectively or one at a time and learn more about all the things that we're going to talk about today, right? Where does the money come from? How do we decide how to spend the money? How much money are we spending? What new, if any, initiatives appear in the budget? What are areas of the budget that we tried to grow this year, but we couldn't? So we've been doing that. Podcasts like this are incredibly helpful. I think that in total, as a part of this year's budget, I've probably presented it now 3 or 4 times to the select board, twice to the finance committee.
And this year you're taking the show on the road.
And this year I'm taking the show on the road. We're going to be at the Center for Active Living on one of the days. We're doing an afternoon session. We're doing a virtual session because, again, we're realizing that not everybody can come to Town Hall. And then, of course, we'll do a traditional evening one at Town Hall for those that are interested. But the opportunities don't end there. I have a very open door policy here in town. So far, I've met with 2 residents about the budget. I'm happy to meet with anybody on a schedule that works for them. I want people at town meeting to feel like they own the budget, they had say in how it was developed. And that's what we're trying to do. Municipal finance, particularly in Massachusetts, which is filled with bureaucracy, is incredibly complex.
Yes.
And so what we've tried to do is break it down to the most basic level and help people understand really what are we asking you to vote on, so that people will have serious questions that others may not be comfortable asking, and a different perspective that I, who lives in this budget document every single day from November until May, it all makes sense to me because I've been living in it, but I appreciate the perspective of residents and staff who aren't in it every day, but kind of have that outside perspective.
So to backtrack a little bit, I think you've answered it. What role do the residents and what roles do the departments play in shaping the budget?
Absolutely. They're 2 distinct but very important roles, and they come together at a certain point in the process. First, our departments play a critical role to tell us, here's how much money we need to continue to provide the level of service we're providing today. That's our instruction every year. We say, listen, provide us a level service budget. A lot of times people conflate that with the level funding budget. We know in this economy, and as long as I've been around, that you can't provide the same level of service year over year for the same dollar amount.
Correct.
Labor goes up, materials go up, utilities skyrocket. So we say to departments, give us your budget request based on what you need to deliver the exact same level of service residents have come to expect. And then we say, but look, we understand our community is growing. And where we're able to, we want to grow the budget to increase or enhance the services that we're providing residents. We don't do this very often simply because our budget is so constrained, and our staff are incredibly innovative and dedicated, and they deliver a high level of service for what we're able to fund. So we say, if you really have a need, if you've recognized a need, whether it's through feedback from the community, through feedback from your staff or the industry, send us a separate memo justifying the request. Tell us the cost, tell us why you need it, tell us the benefit of doing it, and tell us the impact of not doing it. And so we then spend several months working, and by we I mean the town manager's office, our finance director, and input from the select board and finance committee to figure out, okay, here's how much money we think we'll get from our revenues, which is always a moving target. Here's what we need to, at the minimum, fund what we've been doing today. What's the delta? Do we have some wiggle room? And if we do have some wiggle room, here are the various requests that we've gotten. Let's find the ones that are most cost effective and can deliver the biggest benefit to residents. So that's our department's responsibility. Eventually, I get to be the bad guy that says, hey, you know what? We don't have that
Not
much
this
money
year.
today. Let's try again next year. With the focus on maintaining what residents expect today.
Sure.
Select board has input. Like I said, the meeting that we had yesterday to discuss the budget was probably the fourth one. All of these are in public on the website. We can talk about it in a minute. We link every meeting so you can watch it, thanks to Tyngsborough Media. And then the finance committee provides feedback. At a certain point in the next couple of weeks, we get to a final budget, and that's where the residents are critical. That's where we start doing the budget office hours, the pre-town meeting information session. The great thing about the way we do our budget is that every time there's a new iteration of the budget, whether it's that the revenue projections have changed, or we've been able to wiggle in something new into the budget, or maybe vice versa, we've wiggled something out, we post a new iteration of the budget on the website, but you can see the historical budget. So people know what's changing in real time. And then the biggest role residents play, they'll provide us feedback between now and town meeting, but on town meeting floor, it's deciding this is put together the way we want to see it. It's within our means. It's delivering the services we expect, and hopefully, ultimately, it gets approved by residents.
I just thought about this, Colin. So, we talk about the fiscal year starts in July 1 and ends June 30th. And, now we're in the middle of it. When we start thinking about next year, for residents watching or listening to this, when does it start? To me, as a department head, we've done the budget. I feel like my budget is done for next year. But then I feel like as soon as July 1 hits, it's like, oh, well, get ready for it next July. So we're already in July. We're already here.
Yeah.
When does it start?
It never ends. I am constantly thinking about future years, and that's for a few reasons. Everything that we fund today, we're doing it with a keen focus on making sure that it's sustainable and we can continue to fund it into the future. A great example of that is every city and town in Massachusetts received their share of American Rescue Plan Act funds back in 2020. Tyngsborough used those all on one-time capital projects because we are so keenly aware of the fact that anything you add into the operating budget, you've now got to plan 5, 10, 15 years out to be able to fund. So all the while, we haven't approved the fiscal year 26 budget. I'm already worrying about fiscal 27. And that's a mix of reasons. One, it's to make sure that we didn't put anything in the budget this year that we're going to then have to turn around and cut. But it's also because many of our employees, if not most, are represented by collective bargaining agreements. Those are generally 3-year contracts. And so we have to be sure as we're negotiating those that we have an awareness of what is to come in the next 2 or 3 fiscal years, so that we're not over-promising the town's financial resources. So I think technically the budget planning process really starts in earnest in September when we start looking at how the first quarter of the fiscal year is doing on a revenue perspective. And then by October or November, we're sending out budget instructions. But for me, for our finance department, we're thinking about fiscal 27, fiscal 28, and fiscal 29 today as we sit here filming this.
So now, before we dive into understanding the budget for fiscal 26, let's talk about town meeting, the approval process. So right now we're in the middle of the budget season. We'll be meeting in a few weeks. Select board, finance will be finalizing their numbers. So how does the budget get finalized and approved at town meeting?
Absolutely. So at the select board's first meeting in April, I'll present to them my final proposed budget. The select board will then hopefully adopt it. That's the only way it can advance. Once they adopt it, it gets posted with a town meeting warrant. And then we'll spend the month leading up to town meeting doing all the various public outreach that we talked about. And on town meeting floor, it is not a final budget until town meeting votes to adopt that article. And, we're fortunate in Tyngsborough. I think we have such room for public input that we've resolved any of the potential issues before we get to town meeting floor. But in Massachusetts, you are able to amend the budget on town meeting floor. You can eliminate lines. And so until there's a final vote, top to bottom, on the dollar amount that we're proposing and we presented by department, the budget is not final.
Why is it so important for residents to participate in this process? And what impact does their vote have?
It's incredibly important, and it's not just for the obvious reasons, right, that I need a budget to be approved in order to operate. I think that it gives residents really a sense of belonging in the process. We talk a lot about the role that our staff play, and I play obviously a very public-facing role, but what we don't talk about a lot is the role that volunteers play. people volunteer to run for all of these different boards and committees, finance committee, our land use regulatory boards, which play a critical role in ensuring that we're not overdeveloped or
which are
underdeveloped, planning board, zoning board of appeals, and conservation. And I think that having people understand, one, how the process works so that they're comfortable to participate in the project or in the process, and then being comfortable enough to say, you know what, I know enough about the budget or whatever the issue is at town meeting, whether it's zoning or a bylaw, that they then say, you know what, maybe I will step up and volunteer, and maybe I'll start as an associate member on the Conservation Commission until a position opens up on the Conservation Commission for an appointed role, and then maybe I'll jump and I'll run for planning board, or maybe I'll run for school committee, finance committee, select board. I think all of that begins by bringing people into the process. That's the first big benefit. The second is my goal as a town manager, and I think all of our goals across the industry, really is to facilitate the will of a community. I'm very transparent in every discussion I have. I don't live in Tyngsborough. I don't pay property taxes in Tyngsborough. I see my role as a paid professional who's supposed to coordinate the will of the legislative body, which is town meeting, any registered voter in town, and the select board, which again sets long-range policy. And it's hard to do that and to create a operation that truly reflects the community if not enough people are involved.
That's challenging, right? How do you combat that? I mean, we're not the only community that is facing these where you're at town meeting and there's, a turnout of sometimes 125, and some years it's 1,000. How do you change that culture to get people more civically engaged?
I think there's a few different strategies, and admittedly, I don't think I can sit here today and say I've got the final solution, but I'll tell you what we're trying, what I think is working. I think that we have to stop measuring involvement in the old metrics that we used to use, right? We always look at how many people vote in the town election, how many people run for office, and how many people show up at town meeting. Those are all very important, and if we do everything correctly, eventually that number will go up. But I think we have reframed our focus to think about how many touch points do we have with residents on a regular basis. So I think of the Citizens Academy that Tyngsborough Media launched last year and was a tremendous success. I think about the way that we've expanded the ability for people to participate in public meetings, the way we've expanded opportunities for folks to learn about the budget. Maybe I meet with 15 residents about the budget and only 4 of them come to town meeting, but that's still 15 perspectives on the budget that I otherwise wouldn't have had.
And those 15 people will tell other people.
And those 15 people will tell other people. Maybe they'll share on social media. Maybe they'll talk to a fellow parent at the pickup line. And even if they don't come to town meeting to vote, I've now understood what their priorities are. They've had a chance to, and maybe they'll be at one of our breweries or one of our restaurants, and somebody will say, I don't understand, why do we spend money on X, Y, and Z? And because they had the conversation, they can clarify that. So I think it's about increasing the touch points and, again, breaking down the barriers. We have to stop assuming that people will come to us for information, and we've got to be in people's faces respectfully with that information.
All right, let's shift gears and look at this budget. What are some of the key, town meeting, what are some of the key articles related to the budget that residents will be voting on this year?
The biggest one is what is now Article 6. That's the actual operating budget. That's the $52.26 million. There are a couple other financial items that don't necessarily relate directly to the operating budget. There's some use of free cash. There's some use of...
I'm going to interrupt there. What's free cash?
Free cash is not free, for the record. Again, this is your tax money. Free cash is the term the state uses to represent the difference between the revenues you expected to bring in and the revenues you did bring in. Generally, if you're doing things correct, you end up with more revenue than you projected, coupled with the money that you didn't spend that you thought you were going to spend. So essentially, it's any extra money you have at the end of a fiscal year, however it got there.
And what happens to this quote-unquote free cash? What is the strategy in Tyngsborough when it comes to that?
We've used free cash traditionally just to fund capital projects and one-time expenses. We have never, in my time in Tyngsborough, and as far as I can tell, used it to fund the operating budget. And that's an important note because these funds aren't recurring. Once you spend free cash, it's gone.
That's it.
And so this goes back to our talk earlier about sustainability and using ARPA funds. One-time revenues can't be allocated to the operating budget because then the next fiscal year you're now already operating at a deficit. So we've used it for capital. We've used it to beef up stabilization. We've used it to make direct investments into specific areas of government, but never for, say, positions or operating costs, because that is generally viewed in the industry as unwise.
Okay. What are some of the key priorities and major changes in this year's fiscal proposed?
So one of the advantages to having a tight budget like Tyngsborough is that we don't have to have the hard conversations that many communities do about, well, where do we cut? Do we have to cut? So our budget doesn't change much year over year. I would say that there's one new initiative included in this budget, and that is increasing a currently part-time administrative assistant position to a full-time position to support both police and fire. For the last 2 fiscal years, we've included a part-time position in the fire department's budget to support their administrative operations. They are a large department, probably our 3rd largest town department, aside from schools, and they don't have a single full-time administrative assistant. That can be cumbersome as the town grows, as the roles of the fire department grows. And so we've recognized that by adding a part-time position. At the same time, our police department, which does have administrative support, is being absolutely crippled with public records requests. The nature of public records requests, particularly on the criminal justice side, have become increasingly challenging and complex, and that really represents a tremendous liability, because it's not like I get a public records request for bid documents, right? None of that is protected. There's no risk in me sending more documents than somebody wanted. But if you're requesting a police report that includes children's names, that includes victims of domestic violence or victims of sexual assault,
Social Security numbers,
you've now exposed not just the potential victims of that incorrect release, but the town to tremendous liability. We don't have a full-time public records custodian. That's common in many communities, that you would have one. And so what we said was, look, how can we meet both needs, right? The administrative needs of our fire department and the public records needs of the police without crippling our budget. And this was an innovative solution. I'm appreciative to Police Chief Sean Woods and Fire Chief Wes Russell for their collaboration. We're in the interview process right now for the position. So that's the only new position you'll see in the budget. You will see a dramatic increase, a $900,000 increase to support the middle school debt. For those that are familiar, Tyngsborough is nearing the completion in the next several weeks of a new middle school. It is currently under budget and on time, which is great to report, particularly in this environment. But what we said to town meeting when we asked for the debt exclusion vote to approve it, and I'll beat you to your question, a debt exclusion vote is to fund specific projects outside of the levy limit. So the levy limit is that 2.5% limitation I told you about earlier.
Right.
We could never afford the debt service on, say, a $62 million school in the operating budget. You're talking about annual debt service payments of $2.93 million. So what we said to residents was, look, we get this is a big ask. We had several large projects coming online, and so we said we will commit $1 million every year to reduce the debt service payments so that we're only passing on the debt exclusion of a reduced amount. So how does that work practically? The operating budget, if you look at the budget that's posted on the town's website, you'll see there's a line item, general fund middle school contribution, $900,000. Another $100,000 is going to come from the Lakeview lease revenue, which is outside of the general fund. That gets us to $1 million. The debt service payment for the middle school in fiscal year 26 is $2.9 million. Typically, you would just take that $2.9 million, throw it on top of your regular tax bill, and that would be how much residents are asked to contribute. But what we said was, we'll pay $1 million flat out using the general fund, and then we're only moving that $1.9 million. So that's the only other real increase. This is the first year that we're contributing from the general fund. And so you can see that in here. I got to say, because of years of very conservative budgeting practices here in Tyngsborough, our department's living within their means, making do with probably less than they really need. We were able to accomplish that with no reduction in service anywhere in the operating budget.
And no eliminating roles or...
No position eliminations. You know, I will say that on the school side, every year there are positions that are eliminated based on where the school's priorities are, and they add new positions in other areas. But this budget does not represent any service cuts to make that happen.
And is this strategy, will you be using that next year as well? Or is this the ongoing strategy to try to eliminate this long-term budget debt that the town has taken on?
Yeah, the commitment from the select board, the finance committee, the school committee was that every year for the 30 years of the loan, we'd contribute $1 million.
A total, to remind people at home, we borrowed how much for the middle school project?
So far, we've only borrowed $50 million. We are getting reimbursements from the MSBA, obviously.
Which is a Commonwealth agency.
Which is a Commonwealth agency, again, funded through taxpayers in the Commonwealth. We expect at the end of the day that we'll borrow in the ballpark of $52.5 million. At town meeting, when this was approved, I think the number we used was $54.6 million. So we'll be borrowing less than we anticipated. But to date, we've borrowed $50 million.
And the building comes online in the late summer, and
we'll take occupancy of the building in the middle of May, most likely, and on the first day of school in the fall, students will start in the new middle school. And it's a gorgeous building. You know, this is a side note. We had a chance to tour at the middle school building committee last week. It is coming along fantastically. The project team, which is representatives of the school committee, residents, the select board, my office, have done a really tremendous job designing a building that meets our needs not just today, but in 50 years, so that we're not having to construct a new middle school in any of our lifetimes.
Sure. Right. Besides the middle school, any new initiatives or projects that residents should be aware of?
Not included in the operating budget. We are entering tighter budget times. And again, obviously, the fact that we found $900,000 in the budget is a big change. One of the things that residents will see on the flip side is that we have completely eliminated any contribution from the general fund to our roads program. I want to talk about this, if I may, because
Absolutely.
This is certainly the biggest priority I hear from residents.
A hot button topic.
A very hot button topic. So to paint a picture of how we fund roads, up until I would say 2019, 2020, Tyngsborough received about $400,000 a year in Chapter 90, which again is money from the state specifically for roads, and that's all we spent on roads. Nowadays, $400,000
doesn't get you far.
Doesn't get you very far at all.
It costs how much to as our director of DPW would say, to do a mile of road? How much does
over $1 million? Over $1 million, and that's assuming you don't have to do any drainage work, any curb improvements. So over the last 4 to 5 years, we've really taken a hard look at this and said we can't sustain our road network on $400,000. So a couple things came online. One, every year we steadily increased how much we were contributing from the general fund. I think when I started here, we were contributing $100,000. This current fiscal year 25, we're up to $300,000. On top of that, town meeting very wisely dedicated 75% of all cannabis excise. That's a tax charged on cannabis products sold at what is now our single marijuana retailer on Middlesex Road, though we have a second one coming online in the next couple of weeks. 75% of that right off the top goes into a road maintenance stabilization fund and can only be used on roads. Since that came online, that's given us an additional $800,000 a year to spend on roads. On top of that, we've been really good at getting grants, whether it's the Shared Streets grant, whether it's culvert replacement grants. And last year was the first year we saw the benefit of the Fair Share Amendment, commonly called the Millionaire's Tax. That law set a certain percentage of the revenue collected to education and a certain percent to transportation. Tyngsborough's share comes out to about $250,000 a year. So in fiscal year 25, we're on track to spend close to $1.4 million on road projects. It's a mix of preservation projects, full depth reclamations, which is basically a reconstruction. I won't steal our DPW superintendent's thunder.
We'll have to bring him in.
You'll have to bring him in and do a deep dive.
As much as he's avoiding me.
Yeah, we can. I think I know somebody that can make him come in. But for fiscal year 26, we could not both meet our $900,000 contribution and $300,000 to the roads. When we added the $900,000 in, given increases in health insurance, which is not unique to Tyngsborough, it's across the Commonwealth, that put our budget in a deficit. You have to balance your budget. We're not like the federal government. We have to have a balanced budget. And so we had to eliminate the $300,000. Now, the first question that we get is, well, what does that mean for roads? In fiscal year 26, currently today, we have $1.2 million worth of planned projects, just shy of $1.3 million. That's a mix of preservation projects, like I said, and full depth reclamations.
Which is like redoing the road.
Redoing the whole road. Yeah, think about your worst condition roads. Without the general fund contribution, the one that we just eliminated, we have on hand available to spend $1.5 million. Total. So that still leaves us plenty of cushion to accommodate the fact that prices will inevitably go up before we put the project out to bid.
Sure.
It'll allow us to address smaller culvert issues as they come up. And one of the hallmarks of our road program, which again, Jake will have to discuss with you, is that we've been able to creatively add every year a small road or two into our roads project when we see cost savings. We do a really good job at tracking each project to make sure that we're staying within the means of the budget. And so last year we added Deschanel, which is a very small road on the east side of town that was in deplorable condition. 2 years ago we added Danforth Road, which is a very unique road.
Very unique. And
separated from town by Dunstable and was in awful condition. So that still leaves us the flexibility. Now, that assumes Chapter 90 money stays at $400,000. This year in her budget, Governor Healy announced that she was dramatically increasing her proposal for Chapter 90. That proposal would see Tyngsborough get an additional $300,000. So if the legislature, as I encourage them to, follows suit and approves that number, Tyngsborough would actually have $1.85 million available for expenditure and only $1.27 million worth of projects. So why I say all of this is that while we have eliminated the general fund contribution, we are not cutting our roads program. We're not eliminating our road spending. We've been able to shift the burden elsewhere using other revenue sources to make sure that we've met all of our obligations.
in addition to that, and this is really a Jake question thing, his department keeps track of the roads. They keep track of the condition and say, all right, they have there's a grading system as to when a road needs to be redone or taken care of, right?
Yes.
Okay. One thing you mentioned the governor and local state aid. Why is it that the timing, we have bylaws, local laws that the townspeople have set. When it comes to the budget, why is the timing different from Beacon Hill in Boston?
Ronnie, one of the things that I will never try to explain to you is why the legislature works the way it works. But what I will say is that traditionally, the governor comes out with her budget at the end of January. By then, municipalities, in some cases, have already finalized their budget because there are some communities that have early March, mid-March town meetings. We're a little later, so we have some flexibility. The legislature won't vote on their budget and send it to the governor until usually the very last minute in June. By then, any municipality that operates a town meeting form of government has already adopted a budget. So we always rely on the governor's numbers. Generally speaking, her numbers end up being more conservative than where the legislature ends up. And so in a worst case scenario, her numbers change for the better for the town. It's very rare that we would see the legislature cut money, although Chapter 90, of course, would be one area I'll watch. My only guess is that there's more people in the State House to wrangle. Everybody is chasing earmarks for their municipality or for their districts. Perhaps that makes it a little bit more complicated. They're dealing with much larger revenues, so maybe the projection of their revenues is difficult. All I can say is municipalities do a fantastic job getting the budget over the finish line even before the legislature acts.
I just ask questions that residents ask me.
Yeah.
And I would say, when I talk to the town manager, I will be sure to ask them. So looking ahead, what are some of the biggest challenges that the town is facing?
We are in an incredibly tight budget situation as we speak. Tyngsborough has done a really good job in the last several years with what I call smart strategic growth, right? We've got 2 really large permitted warehouse projects that hopefully come online soon. Those types of projects have very minimal impact on the town. From a services perspective, they're right off the highway, limited traffic increase, not sending kids to the school system, so your school spending doesn't have to go up, but they generate a tremendous amount of new growth. Until those come online, we have now basically reserved our new growth to reduce the middle school debt. And so what that means is that we can expect to have lower free cash balances, which just means that we'll have to borrow more for capital. And in the next 3 years, I project that it'll be relatively difficult to add positions or to expand positions. Now, we're not alone, right? You look at some of our neighbors in this region, we're doing much better than them, but that's because we've shown constraint. We've shown the ability to deliver more with less or the same. But, I think one of the things I've been clear at the select board is that this year's budget is extremely tight. Last year, I mentioned this at the select board's meeting yesterday. Last year, we closed the budget with about $300,000 in cushion, as I call it, right? That's revenue we could have generated and spent, but we didn't spend or allocate. The year before that, it was tighter. It was about $50,000.
Correct.
I expect this year we're going to be below $50,000, which is not a desirable place to be at all. But it balances. And so, our departments do an incredible job making sure that they live within their means, and will continue to support local businesses that are looking to expand, all while doing what I think our planning board and zoning board have done very well, which is maintain Tyngsborough's character.
In the past year since you've become town manager, you and the finance team have talked about, long term. How does the town plan for long-term financial stability?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. In the past, we did it kind of, ad hoc. I don't think that we had a formal process. We talked at the select board meeting yesterday about our capital plan, which is a whole nother topic. It's outside of the operating budget, so we won't cover it tonight or today. But we never develop a long-term forecast. I think the last time we did something like that was 2017 or 2018. So we said, look, in order to provide some sort of stability for us to plan ahead, to know what our issues will be, we need to have a comprehensive 5-year budget forecast that looks not just at where we expect our revenues to be, but where our expenses will be. And some of that's difficult to project, right? I mentioned collective bargaining agreements, so I can tell you 2-3 years out what our labor costs will be. Excuse me, but I can't tell you what our utility costs will be, right? I can't tell you what the interest rates on borrowing will be. But we can develop a plan that gives us an idea of what we're looking at. So our finance director, David Andrews, and I attended a 2-day workshop that the state put together to the Division of Local Services to help municipalities use their template to develop a comprehensive plan. It is probably far more comprehensive and complicated than we need it to be in Tyngsborough, so we're still working through it. But that will allow us to really say, okay, the next 2 years are going to be pinch points. But we can say comfortably that we have at least one of the warehouse projects coming online in 3 years, and so that will provide us a little bit more cushion. And it will also help us say, if we're looking 3 years out and things are getting really tight, one of the conversations that happens anytime I'm around a manager from our area is, how can we combine forces? How can we share resources so that we're not doubling efforts? We've been engaged in conversations with Dunstable about helping them out with their ambulance service. They're a call fire department. I don't even think they have any full-time firefighters. We run a full ambulance. And so our chief and their chief and my counterpart in Dunstable have talked about what type of financial support do we need from Dunstable to even consider making that happen in a way that takes full advantage of the resources we're already paying for with some help from a neighbor and solves the problem they have. I expect those conversations are going to become far more common. We do it already with animal control services. We do it from a public health perspective. Tyngsborough is the lead community in a regional public health grant. Those are the things that we're going to see the conversation really steering up.
We're sort of doing it now. We're chatting in here in Westford.
Yes, very appreciative of that.
Very appreciative of our friends at Westford Cat. But yeah, no, those are the things that we need to start looking into and discussing. Yeah,
and the last thing I'll say about looking ahead, one of the things that I think we do a really good job of, and I reiterate this in every budget presentation, is that as much as it's difficult for me to look at our revenues, we're having a good revenue year to meet this 900,000, but other categories of revenues are declining. Our expenses are going up, it's difficult sometimes for me to put together a comprehensive budget in that circumstance. But what we're very mindful of is that the issues that we're having budgeting from a municipality's perspective are being experienced 10 times over at the individual household level, right? We rely entirely on taxpayers, and we can only expect so much from people who live in our community, which is why we have really focused on these creative, kind of innovative solutions that don't increase taxes beyond the 2.5% where completely possible. Because what ends up happening is if you create an environment where you're just asking for more and you're asking for more, you drive out people, and then you've got less people sharing the burden, and it's not good for anybody. So we're very cognizant of that, and that's something that's really at the forefront, I think, of our budget planning and even our department heads. That's something that we reinforce from top to bottom.
It made me think of one thing. You mentioned the rate at the top of our conversation. We're a flat rate. Why is that?
It's a great question.
Usually there's some communities that have a split between the residential and commercial. Why do we have a flat?
Yeah, so one thing I'd note on that is that a split tax rate doesn't actually generate more revenue, for starters. So, I've heard, well, if we split the tax rate, we can get more money by increasing the rate that a commercial property pays. That's not how that works. under every circumstance, no matter your tax rate, you can only increase your tax levy 2.5% plus new growth. So if we're entitled to increase our budget by, let's say that our budget is $100,000, just because I can't do math above six figures, and we have a single tax rate, everybody is paying the same share. If we then split the tax rate, we can still only collect $100,000. It's just that we would collect more from commercial and less from residential. Why doesn't that work in Tyngsborough? Tyngsborough is something like 84, 85% residential. And so you would be increasing the burden on the smallest class of taxes. That has several effects. One, it eventually becomes unbearable and businesses will move to our neighbors that have a single tax rate. When that happens, the burden just gets shifted back onto residents. And so it doesn't really work for community. Now, where you see the split tax rate is a place like a Burlington, which has a far closer to even split between residential and commercial. Cities where that's certainly prominent. But you do that in a town like Tyngsborough, again, you're not collecting any more money, but you're going to drive out businesses and you're just going to increase the burden that our taxpayers pay. What we want to do is be more welcoming to businesses because businesses pay the same tax rate as our residents and enjoy less of the services. They can't send kids to the school district. They can't get trash collection. So it's kind of a trade-off. Not that we're looking to slight anybody, but there really is an advantage to having businesses feel like your community is welcoming to them.
Any trends or factors that might impact, when you're sitting in that, in your office or with the finance team that might impact future budgets?
Absolutely. Labor is the biggest one. Our employees are, I've said this multiple times today, tremendously resourceful. They do a lot with the same resources that they've had. And people that work in Tyngsborough, I truly believe work in Tyngsborough because they want to stay in Tyngsborough, they want to work in Tyngsborough. I have yet to meet an employee in Tyngsborough who is here simply for the money. And if there is an employee like that, they move on to the next town because they pay more. But the reality is, Tyngsborough continues to struggle to be competitive with our peers. I'm working on a collective bargaining negotiation right now, and as a part of that, I was looking overall, comparing our positions, both union and non-union, to our peers. And we are generally 14, 15% below our peers, but there's trade-offs, right? Tyngsborough is a great place to work. I'll put it up against anybody, and I'm not just saying that because I'm here. We have a work schedule that works, I think, for our employees, but also for our residents. We eliminated the half day on Friday. We're still open the same number of hours we were before, but we've shifted those hours to evening so that people who work during the day can come register their dog, can come pay their taxes in person. I think that's a draw for people. We have a great group of residents that live in town. So we are, on average 15% below our peers, but we can make up for that in other areas. Eventually, as you see some of these collective bargaining agreements get settled at 4.5%, remember, Prop 2.5 limits us to 2.5% plus new growth. Tyngsborough is a small town. Eventually, we run out of new growth, right? There's no more parcels to develop. We really prioritize open space. It becomes so that's something that I worry about, and I think that's where our conversations about sharing resources, combining forces, is helpful. Obviously, there are. I've got concerns about the costs of utilities. Those have gone up pretty dramatically. And then uncertainty around some of our bigger projects, like building projects, building improvements, maintaining our buildings. Those are a little less worrisome, I think, because labor has been pretty, steady on its incline. But those are just a handful of things that I worry about.
So you're not replacing us with robots anytime soon?
Absolutely not. I think residents are far better than robots.
That's good. Where can residents find more information about the fiscal year proposed budget? Glad
you asked. If you go to our website, which I've got to credit all of our department heads, our IT department, media department, our website really is, I think, the easiest to navigate municipal website in the Commonwealth, and I mean that seriously. Particularly around the budget, if you go to the town manager's page, on the left-hand side, there's a tab that says Town Manager Proposed Fiscal 26 Budget. That has every budget presentation to date, every budget to date, including all the different iterations, so you can see how things have changed. It's got a full budget schedule. It's got a list of our upcoming budget office hours. And just to make sure there's no confusion, we've also linked every meeting recording. Anytime I present the budget, thanks to Tyngsborough Media, we link the video. So right from that website, you can find everything you need to know about the budget.
What advice would you give somebody that is watching, listening on being involved in just town government, town meeting for the first time, is there anything words of wisdom you would give them?
Absolutely. Don't hold back. I talk to residents all the time who, for various reasons, were uncomfortable getting involved, didn't think they had time. There is a level of involvement for everybody, no matter your work circumstances, you're raising a family. My advice to people who are on the fence is call my office, schedule a meeting to come sit down and talk. I have a lot of really exciting things to talk about here in Tyngsborough, and I can't do much more on this because I'll waste too much time. But I think that if people realize how approachable our staff are, how easy it is to get involved in local government, I think that any fears or concerns or, reluctance people have goes away pretty quickly. So dive in, ask the questions, reach out. We are only as good as the involvement that we get from our residents, and we rely on that very heavily.
We have a few moments left, and I usually, with all my guests, I like to, want to know a little bit more. What makes this role unique for you personally, and what makes Tyngsborough unique?
Yeah, so I'm not a townie, so that just want to say that clearly. I grew up in Lowell. I lived in Tyngsborough for about 10 years before I went to college. So I'm very familiar with the area. I think that this is an incredible opportunity for me because of my past experience, not just living in Tyngsborough, but also working in town. I know a lot of the people. I feel like because I had an opportunity to work in various roles, I got to meet a lot of people that maybe didn't want to meet with the town manager, but I've developed a rapport with. So I feel like I'm able to get really diverse and kind of varying opinions on the different issues. I could be talking to somebody about one issue and they've got, this issue, they've got a whole different opinion than the next person that I talk to. And I think that because I didn't just come from the outside, become a town manager and hide in my office, I think that people know they can reach out to me because of my experience here. And I just think it makes things operate so much more smooth.
You started out an intern, I think, was it 2014 or 2015?
2017.
2017. I wasn't, I was with the org and then left. And did you ever imagine yourself being the second town manager?
No, and it's actually crazy. Forget the intern. I moved to Tyngsborough from Lowell in 2008. And I will be honest, and I think I might have said this in a public comment to the select board, so hopefully this doesn't get me any flack. I loved where I lived in Lowell. All my friends were in Lowell. My parents we lived in Pawtuckettville near North Campus. UMass was expanding.
And you're an alum of Lowell Catholic.
I'm an alum of Lowell Catholic.
And you're also an alum of
Suffolk University, for those that aren't totally clear. I didn't get paid to say that. Anyway, so when I moved to Tyngsborough, I didn't know anybody. I didn't go to public schools. I went to private schools, Lowell Catholic at the time. And so I spent a lot of time at home. And I stumbled upon one evening while I was doing homework, Tyngsborough TV, and I started watching every single select board meeting, sometimes multiple because they would run on a repeat. And I used to think it was fascinating that these people sat up at this podium and made these decisions. It was obvious that they weren't full-time employees. They were volunteers. And this was when Elizabeth Coughlin was on the board, Rich Lemoyne, Karen Pulio, Rick Rowe.
Oh, my God.
And I was fascinated with the way Corey Lambert, I think at one point was watching.
I was here. So,
okay.
Yeah. So
I'd watch these meetings, and I always think back to when I was watching those, and I would be fascinated with them. I think I watched a couple of planning board meetings. It is wild to think that back in 2008, when I was basically protest watching these meetings because I had no friends in Tyngsborough, I was mad at my parents, that 12 years later, a little more than 12 years, 13 years later, you do the math.
Yeah.
That I would be the town manager in Tyngsborough. It's wild to me. And certainly when I was an intern.
This is my first time hearing this story, and I started in Tyngsborough in 2009, and right around that era, just me hearing that, that's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
That's insane.
And I'd ride my bike around and I would see, Sun City had just gotten a liquor license, and I watched that public hearing and I drove by, I'm like, oh, that's Sun City. And so it's incredible. And I think that's the charm of Tyngsborough, right? Tyngsborough has such a rich history. I've learned much more than I knew before.
Yeah, we all have.
But it is crazy to see how far along. I mean, we have a lot of staff that have been, you're a great example. You left for a few years. You came back. I had a brief hiatus from Tyngsborough. I came back. I think people come to Tyngsborough because of the community, and that's 100% because of our residents.
And so Tyngsborough also has other plethora of podcasts, but we've asked you questions. But what's one thing that people should also check out? But what is one thing about you personally that people I mean, people know that we all know you love country music. We all know you are alumni of Suffolk. And you have 2 great dogs.
Yes.
A great partner.
Absolutely.
What is one thing that people should know about you? Oh, and you like mac and cheese. You like mac and cheese.
Yes. Okay. Enough of my flaws, Roni. I think that people should know that I am a huge local government dork, and if there is a community within like a 60-mile radius of Tyngsborough, chances are I've watched their select board meetings. One, because
that's very true.
It helps me better frame what we're dealing with in Tyngsborough. But also, when I'm having a really rough day in Tyngsborough, I like to watch our neighboring communities to kind of feel better about myself.
Colin Loiselle, Tyngsborough's town manager.
Thanks for having me, Roni. And thank you to Westford Cable Access for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you for Westford. And that will do it for this episode of Entering Tyngsborough. You can learn more about town government by visiting the town's website at tyngsboroughma.gov. For the town of Tyngsborough, I'm Roni Camille. Thanks for listening and watching. Until next time, wishing you the best of goodbyes.